Hey there, church family. Week 12 of the E100 reading plan looked at sections of Jesus' teachings. This week we began with Matthew, where Jesus tells us that he's not come to abolish the law. In fact, he's come to fulfill it. This passage tells us that we can't just throw away the Old Testament law, even though certain ceremonial and ritual aspects of the law, like sacrifices and food law, certainly fall away when Christ came. But Jesus tells us that unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, what was the Pharisees' righteousness like? Well, Jesus tells us elsewhere that they were like cups with the outside cleaned and the inside still filthy, or whitewashed tombs, very pretty on the outside and full of a dead corpse on the inside. So, the righteousness of the Pharisees was an external appearance of righteousness, but it wasn't internal. Righteousness that exceeds that of the Pharisees is righteousness that comes from the heart. And that's what Jesus tells us in this section of Matthew, where he quotes two of the 10 Commandments. He says, you've heard that it said, don't murder. You've heard that it said, do not commit adultery. And he expounds those in terms of applying them to the heart. Right? You've heard that said, don't murder, but if you hate your brother in your heart, that's just like murdering them in your heart. If you lust after your neighbor's wife, that's just like adultery in your heart. In my post on Monday, I talked about how throughout this section, Jesus is teaching about outward conformity versus inward heart change. Then, when we looked at the Lord's Prayer on Tuesday, it was the same thing. Right? Jesus says, don't pray like the heathens who babble on as though God cares about many words. Don't think that somehow, by your many hours of long prayers, that you can convince God to act because of your many words. No, the Lord's Prayer doesn't try to convince God to act. It's to the point. It praises him for who he is, and it implores him for our needs for today, both physical and spiritual. In the rest of the section, we have all sorts of teachings regarding what a changed life looks like. There's all sorts of examples. We read that a Christian forgives because he's been forgiven by God. He doesn't fast in a way that makes him be seen by others because he cares more about what God thinks about him. He's focused on Christ's kingdom, not on earthly riches. He doesn't worry because he knows the God who takes care of the birds of the air and the grass of the field. He isn't a hypocrite, but he applies God's word to himself first before he does to others. He comes to God with every request, just as a child comes to his father. If you read the end of chapter 7, Jesus applies all of these things by saying that a good tree produces good fruit, but a bad tree produces bad fruit. Fruit is a sign of the health of a tree. You can't become a good tree by trying hard to make your fruit look really nice. But if you're transformed into a good tree, that will show up for all to see in the fruit you produce. Love for God shows up in a changed life. Before we looked at Wednesday's reading, Thursday's reading was in a very similar vein. The law tells us to love our neighbor. And the question is, who is our neighbor? What does fulfilling that law look like? And the parable of the Good Samaritan tells us that the radical extent that love will go in the life of a believer. We are to care for the outsider, for those in need. True neighborly love is a radical thing. On Wednesday, we looked at Matthew 13. This section has a number of parables, and all of them related to the kingdom of heaven. Now, important to note here, the kingdom of heaven doesn't mean heaven, the place where God's throne is. The kingdom of heaven refers to Christ's reign on the earth. The kingdom of heaven is seen whenever Christians give their allegiance to King Jesus. So, we have the parable of the sower, which tells us that people are like different soils. And when the message of Christ comes, our response to that message reveals who we truly are. The parable of the mustard seed and the parable of leaven tells us how Christ's kingdom started small. 12 disciples in a small region of a nothing country, and how it grew unexpectedly, unstoppably to all reaches of the earth. Just like yeast spreading through a batch of dough, or like a mustard seed growing to a large plant. The parable of the weeds and the parable of the net tell us that in this life, it may not be clear who's a believer and who's not. And in this world, we'll have those who follow Christ and those who don't. But in the last day, the wheat will be separated from the weeds. The good fish and the bad will be separated, and God will judge people's hearts. The parable of the hidden treasure and the parable of the expensive pearl show us that membership in God's kingdom is worth more than anything else. And those who give up all to gain Christ can rejoice. So, in this section we have two questions. How will you respond to Christ's call? And two, are you working to advance Christ's kingdom here on earth? Finally, we end with Luke 15, which has 3 parables. But if you pay attention, they're actually all the same story. A shepherd loses a sheep, and so he expends great energy to find that one sheep. And when he does, there's great rejoicing. A woman loses a coin, and she leaves her others and goes and expends great energy to find that one coin. And when she does, there's great rejoicing. A son is lost, and when he returns to his father rejoices greatly and puts on a feast. These parables begin when Jesus is confronted for eating with sinners. What we should learn from these parables is that God rejoices in the restoration of his children. If you are living in sin, if you are like that prodigal son, come to Christ, and God will not just begrudgingly accept you. He will rejoice over your return. But there's also a warning. We should not be like the Pharisees, or like the older brother in this story who begrudges others coming to salvation. We shouldn't look at people and think they're too bad to be saved. They're beyond salvation. Instead, we should pray even for our enemies to turn to Christ and rejoice when they do. So, we've looked at a lot of Jesus' teaching this week. We saw how his views of the law teach us what true righteousness is. And that true righteousness comes from the heart. And it comes from a changed life. A transformed life produces righteousness. Second, we learned about the spread of Christ's kingdom and how Christ's reign spreads. And we're called to embrace that message and to spread it to others. Then finally, we looked at the great joy that God has in restoring sinners to himself, and the call that we have to rejoice in the salvation of sinners like us.